Hey folks, welcome to Moonshift Audio. Future Islands' new album is just around the corner, so this video is going to show you a start to finish mixdown of the Future Islands style track that I produced in last week's video. If you haven't seen that one yet and you want to see how the production comes together, you can check it out at the link down below. Here's a clip of the finished track.
Just down by the lake, and when I'm looking out, then I can really see through the mist. I know, my darling, that is where you wait. You will listen to the silence, wait for it to break. In my heart of hearts, I know it's always there, and I don't have the strength to leave these thoughts behind.
In a minute I'll show you every plugin on every track in this project, but first I'd just like to say hello, my name's Jack, I'm a producer and mix engineer based in the UK. I put out a new video like this one every week, so please do like and subscribe. If you're looking to level up your mixing skills, then you might be interested in my Mix Exploder service, where I give your track a professional level mixdown here in my studio, and then I make you a personalised video, just like this one, where I go over every element of the mixdown and answer any questions you might have, so that you can see exactly how a pro like me would approach your music. There's more information about the Mix Exploder at moonshiftaudio.com. I'll put a link to that down below, but for now, let's get stuck into this mixdown. So here we are in Cubase, and I think the best way to show you what I've done in this mix is to just go through every track and every plugin one by one. But so a quick word of warning, the previous video where I did the production process for this track, I somehow managed to record in mono. So although there's not a lot of stereo stuff going on in this track, there were a couple of things that I showed you in that video which you would not have been able to hear at all. So I will make sure to go over those little bits of stereo production work in this video. But for now, we're going to start off with the bass. Now, in the previous video, I showed you how I used guitar rig and a simple bit of EQ here to get the basic bass tone. Let's just bypass these other effects and I will show you what I've done. So after the basic tone, I was using an instance of Synth here, not doing too much, but just taking some of the edginess out of the mid-range there. Very subtle, but I was just trying to target that very attacky pick sound. Next up, a compressor, and you can hear that that's just filling it out. Got it 8:1, so reasonably strong ratio there, and a sort of medium. I mean, that's still a fairly fast attack. It's a very snappy compressor, the 1176, and a slow release, and that's just giving us some punch and weight. I'll go with and without. You can hear it actually sort of brings the bass to life a bit. There's a little bit of dynamic there, and that's the attack time. I've got a great video on drum attack times that you can check out if you want to learn more about how you might look to set an attack time on a percussive instrument. I've got a compressor here which is working from a sidechain input from the kick drum. So on its own you'll see that there's no gain reduction occurring, but if I solo the kick as well, and not lots here, just a few dB, but it just does help to give that kick a little bit more space rather than fighting for that limited low end space. I've got an instance of Soothe, which is also sidechain. This is sidechain from the vocals, so we're going to come back to that a little bit later. I'm running a naturalizer here, which is a really neat plugin. It just does very, very subtle, semi-random alterations to the spectral, transient and color, which is a sort of EQ, and I've set that to 8th note so that it's just doing some randomization. It really helps with the robotic nature that you can get from programmed material like this VST bass. Now it's subtle what this does. I'll play it without, and now I'll enable it. It's just making it a little bit less of that machine gun robotic effect. The last plugin in the chain here is a simple gain plugin, and I'm just using that to do some subtle automation where I drop and then gently bring up the volume of that bass part throughout the verse to add a slow build in energy. And I'm using this gain plugin rather than just automating the fader for that channel, because it means that if I want to turn the bass up or down, I can do that without having to reprogram all of the automation. Moving on to the drums now. As I mentioned in the previous video, I bust out the kick, snare, hats and toms to separate channels, so we can have a look at the kick to start with. Now I've got quite a lot of compression going on here. This is without. It's just bringing out a bit of the body and adding some attack to that kick. I've got a video from a couple of weeks back where I showed you how to set the attack time on a drum compressor, which is helpful if you want to know how I came to this setting. Following the compressor, I've got a Pro Q and massive amounts of mud I'm scooping out here. And just a little bit of the presence. So if I was to bypass this, you can hear it's just so much tighter with that EQ in. Good old decapitator. This is bypass. Just adding a little bit of extra harmonic content there to help that cut through the mix. I was having some issues in this mix with the kick drum in particular eating up a lot of headroom. So one way to get a bit of extra volume out of a drum in particular without increasing the loudness and saving some headroom is to clip the very peaks of the wave off. So I'm using the standard clip here, and you can see here just a tiny bit being clipped off. Can't really hear it, especially in the mix, but it does help you get a little bit of extra volume there. Finally, another instance of naturalizer at about 31%. Just trying to add some human element back into that programmed kick. Looking at the snare now, again, we're starting off with a compressor. Not loads of gain reduction here. Just brings out the tails, which in the context of the mix helps the snare to just be a little bit more powerful. EQ wise, rolling off the low end, not much else going on here. I'm scooping out some mud. I usually find between 350 450 hertz is a good place to look for the mud in just about any source. Decap. Just adding a bit of extra oomph. And another naturalizer. The naturalizer is a cumulative kind of thing. You find if you add it to several very straight program parts, it really adds up. Looking at the hi-hats now, not much going on here. I've rolled off the lows, as you might expect with a hi-hat, and put in a little bit of a sort of upper mid presence boost. Just to bring out the tap of the stick on the hat there. And the toms I've literally left unaffected. Now, as we saw in the production video, one way that I've really added some snappiness and sizzle to the snare is by layering an electronic snare over the acoustic snare. So this is without. Doing some quite drastic EQ on this. To me, that just sounds a bit shrill, and really what I wanted was some kind of mid-range power. And now it just sounds almost like part of the same drum with that EQ, obviously rolling off the lows. And you guessed it, another naturalizer, just to add some subtle variation between hits. The snare is sending to a drum reverb bus where I am using the RMX 16 in a non-linear snare preset. I've got a video about how to get a nice 80s drum reverb out of this particular unit. You can check that out on my channel. And it's just giving that snare just a little bit of space. So if I bring in the drums, and here's that snare reverb. Kind of makes it feel real, even though it's a very digital reverb. That. On the drum bus, I'm going to look at the plugins on this drum bus in reverse order, because actually the last thing I put on was a limiter, again to help with that headroom issue. So you can hear there that the limiter is really adding a nice bit of punch to those drums, and it's also adding really quite a lot of perceived volume without adding actual loudness, which is really going to help with our headroom. Previous to that, I've got a decapitator. Just adding a little bit of attitude, a few extra harmonics. I've got a Pultec. Just adding a little bit of top end to those drums. A compressor for the overall bus, which just helps to kind of glue it all together and add a little bit of extra volume. Prior to that, in order to get a bit of saturation, it's really good to saturate before you compress. I'm using the UAD Ampex tape. It's just a nice bit of quite subtle excitement. And at the very start of the chain, I do love the Baby Audio iHeart NY for a bit of parallel compression. I'm not doing much here. Just bringing out the reverb tails a little bit and just adding a subtle bit of extra volume and saturation. So we've got the drums and the bass there. Let's have a look at our pads. So this first mellow saw pad, I've just really brought a lot of treble out with the EQ and scooped out the lows. And if we want to listen to that in the context of the mix, you just hear not nearly so present without that. And the Prophet brass, back in the production video, I rolled off the low end, nothing's changed there. But I'm using another EQ here. And what I'm doing with this one is using an automated bypass so that when the vocal comes in, the presence, this quite intense high shelf, is applied. So this is without. And now that's just nicely muted at this point when the vocal joins.
Lonely, and if I let it out,
just helps the song to breathe a bit, those little moves like that. Okay, so onto the main ARP now, and this is one of the sounds that I was talking about in the production video last week, where I was saying how lovely and wide this Echo Boy can help to make things. And of course that was recorded in mono, so you wouldn't have been able to hear that at all. So I'm just going to bypass the other effects. We can listen to this on its own with the Echo Boy bypassed to start with. And now as I enable it, we can listen to some width, hopefully. Really nicely thickening that up. If I was to put this onto normal mode, it still thickens the sound, but it doesn't add that widening, which I really like. That's also being emphasized by the amount of saturation that's being applied just to the delayed signal in this plugin. After that, it's just some pretty simple EQ. I'm using a Pultec to boost the high end at about 10k, but I'm also pulling a little bit out of that same frequency using the classic Pultec trick, which stops things getting too harsh around the point where they're boosted. You can hear just a bit of high end presence coming onto that. I've also got a gain plugin, which is just being used to automate a level boost for the intro only, and then it drops back. Here you can see when the vocal comes in. With the other layers of the ARP, as I suggested in the production video, I've dropped quite a lot out of the low end of this layer, and I've just put a couple of little bumps in to emphasize areas of the frequency range that I thought complemented the main ARP. You can hear all that low end's gone, and it just feels like part of that synth now rather than a separate layer. The high arp I've not affected at all. I thought that was fine as it was. This high note sustain, again, was absolutely fine. I'd already rolled out a lot of the low end and some harshness in the production phase, and the delay and the transformer were applied in production. I think it's an important thing to note that not everything needs to be mixed with a million plugins. I think there was a time when I used to think every track needed to have a plugin or 3 plugins on it. Everything had to be compressed, everything had to be EQ'd, and it's just not the case. There are usually several tracks in any project that I mix where I won't do any processing at all, and just a bit of level and pan is enough. So we've now covered all of the instrumental parts from the intro of this track, and we're getting on to the point where the vocal comes in. So let's have a look at the vocal chain. There's quite a lot going on with this, so I'm going to turn off all of these and we'll go from the top. So we begin by scooping out some of the low end and the mud in that same region I mentioned before.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
And what that's going to do is, before we get into the compressors, the low end and the muddiness area do carry quite a lot of energy, and they're going to trigger the compressors to act on frequencies that we're going to remove anyway. So it's a cleaner way to run your compressors by scooping out some of the unwanted parts of the signal before it even hits the first compressor, which is, in this case, a Blue Stripe 1176. I love this on vocals. It's very grabby, and I'm just using it here, 4:1 ratio, medium attack, slow release.
And if I let it out,
just grabbing the
it
peaks.
might take over me.
I mean, there's a reasonable amount of reduction there. We saw it hit -7 on one of the lines, but it's not just slamming the needle the entire way through. It's just taming the peaks, leveling things out a bit. You can see that actually before I got to there are a few lines here where I've done some clip gain just to level things out even more. We next get to the LA2A. I really do like this plugin. It's one of my all-time favorite compressor plugins. It's also super simple. And after you've leveled out the peaks, you can do a bit more consistent
There is inside of me a little
gain
lonely.
reduction with this.
And if I let it out, it might take over me. There is inside of me.
This silver version is also voiced quite bright. So there's some very nice and very subtle saturation and brightening going on, which suits a pop vocal really, really well. And also really complements the next compressor in the chain, which is Waves RVox, one of the few Waves plugins that I still use with any regularity. RVox does a nice thing
Inside of me, a little lonely.
where it feels like it adds a bit of body to the sound. So if I bypass it,
And if I let it out, it might take over me.
it's not just compressing. There's a very flattering, just a bit of body that I really like that it brings to the sound. So especially in series with the Silverface LA2A, you get that sparkle, you get that body, and you're getting some really nice tone shaping before you even move on to EQ. Next up, it's Soothe time. I'm using Soothe just as a de-esser. I think it's an excellent de-esser.
There is inside of me
So you can see
a little lonely.
on that S there, it really does take it out, but it's in a very nice, natural and transparent way. It doesn't really tend to make a vocal sound lispy like some de-essers can when you hit them hard. The next Soothe is acting in a much more traditional fashion. I'm using it to tame some resonances.
It might take over me.
Not much, just a couple of dB at the most, but it is a nice way just to help smooth things out. Next up, we're getting into EQ world, and the first thing I've got here is a Marg EQ4, which I really love on a vocal in particular. I sometimes use this EQ just for the air band, which is kind of a magical thing. I think that almost warrants a video of its own. But suffice to say, it's just adding, I'm only using a couple of dB here at 20k, a little high end boost here, a dB at 2.5k, and I'm just putting half a dB in at the low end. And if we play this without,
there is inside of me a little lonely.
And with.
There is inside of me.
You can just hear it's adding.
A little lonely.
Air is the word, particularly on the top of the vocal there. I like working with a plugin that is built a little bit. This is based on a hardware unit where you've actually got some frequencies which are being selected for you. They're not variable apart from the air band, but they are nicely chosen. And sometimes having those restrictions just pushes you into a nice creative space. Following that, Marg EQ, I'm doing the classic pull tech trick again at 8K this time. I'm also putting in some low end, so I'm putting in a few dBs at 100 Hertz and quite a big boost, 6 dB at 8K with a similar amount of attenuation, 5 dBs attenuation there. And what that's doing is just brightening this up and adding even more body. So I'll play this without the plugin.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
And with.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
Just really, piece by piece, just adding that nice tone shaping that we want for this vocal. Next up, we got Soft Tube Tape, which is probably my favourite tape emulation plugin.
There is inside of me.
Not driving it hard, this is a very subtle effect.
There is inside of me a little lonely. There is inside of me a little lonely.
But it's just adding just a really nice subtle bit of harmonic distortion there. Final plugin here is Fresh Air by Slate Digital. Reasonably restrained. To be honest, much more than 30 or 40% on this, and you just start to really destroy things and make them sound really harsh and crispy. But it is nice in moderation. This is without.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
And with.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
Just adding a bit of poppy sizzle and sparkle to the top end of that vocal. Finally, the customary gain plugin, which again I'm just using to put in a slow build. I think we're adding like 1 dB over the course of the verse there, just to kind of add some energy. For the sends from this vocal channel, I'm going to a vocal reverb, which has got the lows and highs scooped out before that signal hits the 480L. We looked at this in the production video. It's a plate preset that I've tweaked. Then I'm scooping out a little bit more of the low end with another EQ.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
You can just hear there's a bit of muddiness without this.
A little lonely.
In those tails.
There is inside.
And finally, a compressor, which is sidechained from the vocal itself.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
Because the reverb tail from the vocal is going to be occupying a very similar frequency range to the vocal itself, you can get masking from the reverb. So by using a sidechain duck to move that reverb out the way when the vocal is present, you just carve out a bit more space to keep that vocal front and center. The other sends from this vocal channel are to 2 instances of Soothe. I've got one which is on the entire synth bus. So this is all of the melodic instruments. And using a sidechained instance of Soothe,
there is inside of me.
I'm just helping to move this
a little lonely
out the way a little bit.
And if I let it out, it might take over me.
And we can see the same thing happening on the bass with this instance of Soothe.
There is inside of me a little lonely.
Because the vocal is quite baritone, it does actually fight a bit in the mix for space with that bass. So pulling this sidechain Soothe trick is a nice way just to get a little bit of extra space in the mix. Now, I think it's important to say at this stage that this is not something that you can do. If you've got loads of keys and guitars and drums and bass and everything all occupying that space where you want your vocal to sit, bussing it all together and slapping a Soothe on is not gonna give you a clean, spacious mix. It's a neat trick to give you an extra few dB and just that last 10%, but your arrangement and your main EQ moves are the go-to way to get that separation. I'm aware we haven't listened to much of the track at this point, so I'm just going to deactivate the loop and we'll play through to where the guitar comes in.
And if I let it out, it might take over me. There is a special place just down by the lake, and when I'm looking out, then I can really see through the mist. I know, my darling, that is where you wait.
Okay, so on the guitar, we looked at almost all of this in the production video. So really, in the mix, all I've done here is scooped out almost all the low end and put a little bit of a 1K presence bump. So let's hear it without the EQ. And now with. It sounds quite thin with that EQ in. And this is a good example of why we don't generally try to work in solo. Obviously, I'm doing a huge amount of soloing in this video to show you what I'm doing. But when I'm actually mixing, I'm almost always working not in solo, because you'll get things like this guitar sounds a bit thin with that EQ in, but in the context of the mix,
Yes, I know, my darling, that is where you wait.
that low end is filled out by the pads, the kick, the bass, and to some extent the vocal, so you don't miss it at all. In the production video, I was talking about how nice the panned shimmer verb was on this guitar, but in mono, as that video was, you won't have heard it, so let's just have a quick listen to that on its own. Really nice way to add a bit of soundstage to that. The guitar is slightly left, the reverb is more to the right, and sure, you could argue that that's a little bit unbalanced towards the right side of the stereo field, but it doesn't matter. In the mix,
Through the mist, I know, my darling, that is where you wait. You will listen to the silence, wait for it to break.
bit of gain automation here just to raise it up where it's not supported by those bells,
In my heart,
and we're into the chorus. Now when it came to the chorus, the first thing I looked at was this main DX7 keys sound, and I'll just bypass the plugins that I've used on there. The first thing I noticed was that the sort of glassy attack of those notes was just a bit harsh, so I'm using an envelope shaker to soften the attack there. Looks like this. You can see I've just pulled the attack all the way down. Then we're into compressor, doing a really solid amount of compression, and that's just adding a lot more body and consistency, solidity to that sound. Finally, EQ, taking out a lot of that low end. There's loads down there that we don't need. After that, it's mostly just EQ. For the saw, for example, all the low end's gone. So much down there. And a bit of sizzle added. The Echo Boy we looked at before. Literally just the bass roll off left in that guitar bells layer. And the Moog bell again, just the roll off. Now all of these sounds I've bussed to a chorus chords bus with an instance of soothe, because there was a bit of harshness building up where those synths were all occupying a similar frequency range, so this just helps to tame that. And a bus compressor, which just helps to sort of glue those sounds together so they feel more like one instrument. If I turn those off,
I know it's always there, and I don't have the strength to leave these.
Just helps it to sit back in the mix a little bit. At this point, we've pretty much covered every part of the mix. it's worth looking again perhaps at these little bits of automation that I've done. So the hats, for example, I've pulled down the volume when we get to this open hat section in the chorus. For some reason with this Groove Agent kit, the open hat is much, much louder than the closed hat. So to compensate for that, I've done a huge gain drop when we switch to it. If you want to listen to that on its own, this is just the verse hat, then going into the chorus. So you can hear there's actually no change in volume there, and I've achieved that by automating the gain. I think that's pretty much it for the main points of this mix. I'm going to let the track play out. Obviously, if you've got any questions about anything else that I did here, please do feel free to put that in the comments down below. And please do like and subscribe if you found this video useful.
There is a side of me that no one ever sees, and if I let it out, it might take over me. But in this special place, just down by the lake, there is a little hope that I can let it be. Through the mist I know, my darling, that is where you wait. Silence, wait for it to break. In my heart of hearts, I know it's always there, and I don't have the strength to leave these thoughts behind. And in my heart of hearts, I wish that you were here. Without you I can't face the silence in my mind.